Welcome to Shadows of Tinseltown, where we explore the real stories that the studio system tried to bury.
You see, Maggie, the problem with the Francis Farmer story isn't the lack of drama. It's the abundance of it. We're dealing with narrative pollution, a clotted sediment of half-truths and Hollywood lore that has hardened over the decades into an impenetrable shell. People treat her life like a gothic novel, all shadows, screaming, and moonlit asylums, which is the quickest way to bury the actual woman under a mountain of sensationalist debris. To understand Farmer, you have to stop looking for a ghost and start looking for a victim of a very specific, very legal machinery. We tend to romanticize the mad starlet breakdown as a poetic collapse of the spirit, but there is nothing romantic about a court-ordered silencing. The files don't lie, Maggie, but the storytellers usually have an agenda that involves selling tickets to a tragedy.
But the sensationalism is why we still talk about her, isn't it? The rebel starlet, the lobotomy, the God was gone essay in high school. It's the ultimate old Hollywood tragedy. It's like a noir film that never ended, where the detective never finds the body because the body is still walking around, haunted. You can't deny the power of that image. The beautiful girl in the back of the police car, her face a mask of primal fury as she screams at the flashbulbs, her hair a bird's nest of defiance. It's the iconography of a woman who refused to be a product. If we take away the ghost story, don't we just have a sad story about a woman who lost?
We have something much more dangerous. A case study in social control. I see a woman who was likely neurodivergent or simply possessed of a fiercely uncompromising intelligence, trapped in a studio system that functioned like a high-end Victorian asylum. You call her a rebel starlet. I see a proprietary asset.
A proprietary asset? You make it sound like she was a patent, not a person.
To Paramount, she was. They wanted a blonde sphinx who looked like Greta Garbo but behaved like an obedient debutante. Think about the contract players of that era. They weren't just employees, they were moral wards of the corporation. The Hays Code wasn't just for the films, Maggie. It was for the biology of the people who made them. It was a form of social hygiene. The option system was the first snare. The studio owned your time in 6-month blocks. They decided who you dated, what you ate, and what political opinions were safe for the box office. If you gained 5 pounds, you were in breach of contract. If you stayed out too late with the wrong element, union organizers, poets, the unwashed intellectuals, the fixers, like Eddie Mannix at MGM or Howard Strickling at Paramount, would be at your door before dawn to scrub the scene or threaten the tabloids with pulled advertising revenue. Mannix was the ghost in the machine, Maggie. He didn't just hide bodies, he hid souls. If a star didn't want to play the game, Mannix and his ilk didn't just fix the problem, they liquidated the asset's reputation. They had a studio morgue, a literal vault of dirt they could leak to the press the moment a contract became inconvenient. They were the architects of the narrative long before the doctors ever arrived. Consider the block booking of a human life. The studio didn't just buy your movies, they bought your biography. They would write your life story for the fans before you even lived it. When Frances refused to play the sweet Seattle girl, she wasn't just being difficult, she was destroying the inventory. She was an expensive machine that refused to run on the provided fuel. The studio's response was a form of industrial sabotage. They broke the machine so no one else could use it.
But what about the loan-out system? You mentioned she was being rented like a car. If the evidence shows she was a star of her magnitude, how could she be struggling?
Oh, she was wealthy on paper, but a pauper in practice. They could ship her off to a rival studio like a piece of livestock, pocketing a 500% profit while she received only her base salary. When she made Come and Get It for Samuel Goldwyn, Goldwyn paid Paramount a fortune for her services, thousands a week, but Frances saw none of it. She was still on her rookie contract, receiving a pittance, while Goldwyn billed her as the greatest discovery of the decade. Think about the psychological toll of that, Maggie. You are the face on every billboard, but you can't afford a car that doesn't belong to the studio. You are a goddess in the eyes of millions, but you have to ask a man in an office for permission to visit your mother. They marketed Frances as the star who wouldn't go Hollywood, which was a brilliant piece of irony, marketing her rebellion to sell tickets. They turned her genuine distaste for the machine into a sales pitch, until the pitch started hurting the bottom line. It's easy to sell a rebel, Maggie, until the rebel starts questioning the salesman's ethics, or worse, his ledger. The moment she began to see the bars of the gilded cage, they decided the bird needed to be muted permanently. The studio owned her image, her name, and eventually, they believed they owned her mind. They didn't just want her talent. They wanted her obedience as a form of capital. In their eyes, her autonomy was a form of embezzlement.
So the rebellion was part of the brand? That's cynical, even for you, Richard. You're saying they sold her nonconformity until it became inconvenient? Like a novelty act that stayed on stage too long? If the studio was selling her as a rebel, they must have expected her to actually be one, right? They were surprised when the act turned out to be her actual character?
Hollywood is built on the commodification of the authentic, Maggie. It's a vampire that feeds on the very souls it pretends to celebrate. They wanted the look of rebellion, the tousled hair and the moody stare, but not the actual conviction. They wanted her to play the girl next door with a secret. But Frances didn't have a secret. She had a world view. She refused to attend the fake arranged dates with leading men designed for the gossip rags, refused the starlit wardrobe of silk and feathers in favor of slacks and a scowl. And most offensively to the studio bosses, she opted for the grit of the group theater in New York over the glamour of a studio lot. She chose a salary of $75 a week on Broadway over $2,500 a week in Hollywood just to do work that mattered. Think about the contrast in acting styles, too. Hollywood wanted posing, the grand theatrical gestures of the silent era carried into the talkies. Frances wanted the method. She wanted to work with Clifford Odets and Stella Adler, people who treated acting as a social weapon, not a beauty pageant. When she went to New York to star in Golden Boy, she wasn't just escaping a contract. She was declaring an artistic war. Paramount saw this as a breach of intellectual property. To them, her talent was a mineral they had the right to mine. When she came back, they weren't welcoming her home. They were reclaiming a fugitive. They made sure her next few roles were beneath her, vapid, decorative, humiliating. A form of professional torture designed to break her spirit before they ever had to break her body. They cast her in world premiere just to show her that they could turn her talent into trash if they felt like it. It was a disciplinary measure. They were trying to induce a psychological foreclosure on her career.
The morals clause. That was the legal loophole, wasn't it?
It was a catch-all for any behavior the studio found unsavory. In the 1940s, that wasn't just a career choice, it was an act of war. Breaking a contract with a studio was akin to heresy. They didn't just fire her, they dismantled her reputation. They used the press as a scalpel before anyone ever touched her with a medical one. They started leaking stories about her temperament and instability to Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons long before she ever had a breakdown. It was a preemptive character assassination. If you can convince the public a woman is crazy, you don't have to listen to a word she says about how you've treated her. Silence becomes the default medical prescription for the inconvenient. It turns a whistleblower into a hysteric. The tragedy of Frances Farmer is that her madness was a diagnosis designed to preserve the sanity of a corrupt industry. Look at this memo from 1939. Farmer is proving resistant to standard publicity hooks. Suggest we pivot to the troubled genius angle. It provides cover for future erraticism. They were already building her gallows before she'd even finished her third film. They were creating the evidence they would later use to save her in an asylum. Her collapse was a manufactured product, just like her movies.
So, let's look at the evidence from the beginning. The God was gone essay. That was real, right? In every biography, that's the inciting incident for her supposed atheism and radicalism. It sets the stage for her being anti-American.
Oh, it was real. A high school essay titled God Dies. She made headlines again 4 years later as a drama student when she won a trip to the Soviet Union by selling subscriptions to a leftist newspaper. In the eyes of the burgeoning Red Scare in Seattle, a city already on edge from the general strike of 1919 and the Hoovervilles popping up on the waterfront, that was basically a one-way ticket to a lifelong watch list. She wasn't a revolutionary. She was a 16-year-old engaged in critical inquiry regarding the silence of the heavens. I have the transcript here. Look at the date. 1931, West Seattle. She wrote, and I quote, "I felt rather proud to think that I had found the truth myself, without help from anyone. It puzzled me that other people hadn't found out too. God was gone. We were younger. We had reached past him. Why couldn't they see it? It still puzzles me." That wasn't a call to arms. It was a cry for help from a teenager trying to make sense of a collapsing economy. The public, however, didn't want a girl with an inquisitive mind. They wanted a scapegoat for their own anxieties. She gave them both, and they never forgave her for the complexity. By the time she hit Hollywood, the FBI already had a file on her that was thicker than her first script. J. Edgar Hoover didn't like free thinkers, especially blonde ones with a platform. She was pre-guilty of intellectual independence long before she ever stepped in front of a camera. They didn't see an actress. They saw a cell leader in a fur coat. And the moment she arrived in Hollywood, the local Red Squad was already tapping her phone, looking for any slip that would let them label her a security risk. Her madness was a political convenience before it was a medical one. They treated her intellect like a contagion that needed to be quarantined.
And then Hollywood happens. The arrests, the hit and run. The story always goes that she spiraled because she couldn't handle the fame, or because she was difficult and unstable on set. I read that she used to scream at directors and show up barefoot to the Oscars of her day. That sounds like a woman losing her grip, or, at the very least, a woman who had reached her breaking point.
Difficult is the word men use for women who ask for the receipts, Maggie. It's the linguistic equivalent of a straitjacket. The hit and run in 1942 was a broken headlight in a wartime blackout zone, hardly a capital offense, and a refusal to be bullied by a traffic cop who thought he could humiliate a movie star. Then came the hotel room brawl at the Knickerbocker and the court appearances. If you look at the transcripts, you don't see a mad woman. You see someone who is exhausted, likely self-medicating with alcohol, to dull the edges of a world that wouldn't let her breathe, and reacting with justified rage to a system that was actively gaslighting her. In the courtroom, she threw an inkwell at a judge. People call that insane. I call it a very concise, very messy critique of the judicial system. They didn't send her to jail. They sent her to the psych ward. It's a cleaner way to dispose of a nuisance. If you're a criminal, you have rights. A trial, a lawyer, a release date. If you're a patient in 1943, you have none. You are simply unfit, and your life becomes the property of the state. It was a legal kidnapping disguised as medical concern. It wasn't about her health. It was about her compliance. They weren't trying to mend her mind. They were trying to mend her behavior until it fit a script she hadn't written. The doctors were just more fixers, only their offices had white tiles and padded walls. They diagnosed her with schizophrenia, which in 1944 was a catch-all for woman who won't shut up. They stripped her of her clothes, her name, and her dignity to see if she would finally play the part. They weren't curing her. They were breaking her spirit of contradiction.
But the spiral into the asylums, that wasn't just the studio, was it? Her family, her mother Lillian, she was the one who signed the papers. That's the part that feels like a betrayal from a horror movie. A mother trading her daughter for a quiet life and a steady income. It's the most unnatural part of the whole crime scene. Why would a mother do that?
Lillian Farmer is the prosecutor in this drama. When Frances stopped playing the game, she became useless to Lillian. Worse, she became an embarrassment to the Farmer brand Lillian was trying to build. Lillian was a failed actress herself, a woman who saw her daughter as a second chance at the spotlight she never quite caught. She wanted the furs, the dinners at Romanoff's, the social elevation that came with being Frances Farmer's mother. When Frances's career faltered, Lillian's social standing faltered. The checks stopped coming. So, the mother used the most potent weapon available to a parent in the 1940s, the commitment paper. Frances was sent to the Kimball Sanitarium first, and then it became a revolving door of institutions. It wasn't about curing her. It was about containing a woman who refused to be a source of income. Lillian literally traded her daughter's autonomy for the approval of a society that demanded daughters be compliant. It's a Victorian ghost story dressed in mid-century modern furniture. Lillian didn't want a daughter. She wanted a trophy she could control. And when the trophy wouldn't stay on the shelf, she decided to break it. She was more afraid of poverty and social irrelevance than she was of her daughter's suffering. It's a cold, hard financial transaction disguised as maternal grief.
That brings us to Stillicum, the Western State Hospital. That's where the detective in me gets stuck. The stories of the horrors there. The ice baths, the rats, the soldiers from the nearby base being allowed into the wards for recreation, the rumors of rape and systemic abuse, and the lobotomy. Shadowland made it sound like a house of horrors where they literally stole her soul with a spike. I can't shake the image of her sitting in a chair, vacant, while they scrambled her memories. It's the ultimate violation of the self. Was it really that bad, or is that more narrative pollution?
It was worse, but not in the way the movies tell you. Reality is rarely that cinematic. And here is where we find the fable problem. William Arnold's Shadowland is a compelling read, but as an archivist, I have to tell you, it's largely fiction. There is zero medical evidence, no hospital logs, no surgeon's notes, no post-operative scars, that Frances Farmer ever underwent a transorbital lobotomy. None. Not a single shred of clinical proof exists in the archives of Western State, and believe me, I've looked at every scrap of paper from that decade. Even the orderlies from that era who were interviewed later said it was a fabrication designed to give the book a punchy ending. Arnold literally invented the climax because the truth, the bureaucratic erosion of a soul, didn't test well with audiences. It wasn't scary enough for a paperback. The actual treatments were a form of architectural and psychological warfare. They used hydrotherapy, which sounds like a spa treatment, but was actually being strapped into a tub of ice water for 8 hours until your skin turned blue and your heart nearly stopped. They used insulin shock therapy, where they put the patient into a hypoglycemic coma every morning for weeks, inducing massive seizures that could literally snap the patient's spine. They weren't trying to heal her mind. They were trying to exhaust her until she stopped being a problem. And then there was Metrazol. Metrazol shock therapy was particularly sadistic. It induced a sensation of impending death, a primal terror that was supposed to reset the nervous system. Imagine being executed and revived, over and over again, for weeks on end. That wasn't medicine. It was a slow-motion execution of her will. The lobotomy myth is a clean surgical story. The reality of Metrazol is a messy, visceral nightmare.
Wait, really? But that's the most famous part of her story. It's the climax of the movie with Jessica Lange. The ice pick procedure by Walter Freeman? How can that be fake? It's practically the cornerstone of her legacy as a martyr. If she wasn't lobotomized, why do we all believe she was? Why would Arnold make that up?
Because it's the climactic third act people crave. It provides a clean, surgical explanation for her quietude in later life. It's the monster under the bed theory. Walter Freeman kept meticulous records of his work. He was a narcissist who wanted to be the father of modern neurosurgery and kept scrapbooks of his patients like they were trophies. Farmer's name appears nowhere in his logs, and he was never shy about his celebrity cases. Her own family denied it. Her later appearances on television show a woman who was clearly traumatized, yes, but not someone who had been surgically disconnected from her personality. The truth is actually bleaker. She wasn't fixed by a surgery. She was broken by years of systemic institutionalization, the loss of her agency, and the sheer, grinding weight of being told she was crazy until she stopped fighting back. It wasn't one doctor with a spike. It was 5 years of hydrotherapy and insulin shock therapy, which induces violent seizures that can break a person's bones. They essentially tortured the rebel out of her using the wet sheet pack, wrapping a patient in freezing, wet linens until they nearly stopped breathing from the chill. The myth of the lobotomy is actually a comfort to us because it localizes the evil into a single instrument. It's a bedtime story for adults who don't want to admit that we collectively destroyed her. We want to blame a mad doctor, so we don't have to blame a sane society. A lobotomy is an anomaly. The system is the rule.
A comfort? How is an ice pick in the brain a comfort? That sounds like a nightmare. You're saying we prefer the idea of her being mutilated? That seems backwards. Why would we want her to have suffered that way?
Because it's a single identifiable evil, Maggie. It's easy to hate a monster. If she was lobotomized, we can blame one doctor, Walter Freeman, and his hubris. We can call him a monster and feel safe in our own beds knowing that doesn't happen anymore. If she wasn't, we have to blame the mother, the studio, the judges, the nurses, the neighbors, and a society that simply didn't like uppity women who didn't know their place. A lobotomy is a horror story. Systemic neglect is a social indictment. We prefer the horror story because it lets everyone else off the hook. We would rather believe her brain was destroyed by a needle than admit her spirit was crushed by our own collective indifference. The lobotomy is a clean ending. The truth is a slow, messy erosion of a human being's will. It's much harder to fight a fog than a man with a spike. We are the fog, Maggie. Every time we watch a movie about her and enjoy the tragedy, we are participating in the system that broke her. We are the ones demanding she stay in the back of that police car for our entertainment. We consume her pain and call it cinematic.
It makes her later life feel even more haunting. I remember seeing clips of her hosting Frances Farmer Presents in Indianapolis in the late 50s. She looked so composed, so polite. She had that perfect mid-Atlantic accent, every hair in place. But there was something in her eyes. It was like she was watching her own life happen from a great distance, like she was a guest in her own body, reading a script she didn't write. Was she happy then? Or was she just gone?
Happy is a luxury for those who haven't been erased. That was the new Frances, the one who had learned to play the role of the recovered woman because the alternative was returning to the ward. She spent her final years as a local celebrity, introducing the very movies that had been part of her undoing, reading scripts for the evening news with a haunting, robotic perfection. She was the model of successful rehabilitation, which is to say, she had finally learned to be the product they always wanted her to be. She was a Stepford version of herself, built from the scar tissue of her previous life. She was essentially an actor playing a character called Frances Farmer who was doing well. It was her final, most heartbreaking performance. She had traded her fire for a paycheck and the right to sleep in her own bed. She even wrote an autobiography, Will There Really Be a Morning? Though most scholars believe her friend Jean Ratcliffe ghost-wrote the most sensational parts of it after Frances died, to ensure it would sell to the true crime-hungry public. Even in death, she was being edited for consumption. They turned her final words into a ghost story before her body was even cold. She died of esophageal cancer at 56, largely alone, in a house that felt more like a bunker than a home. History isn't a ghost story, Maggie. It's a ledger of choices. Frances Farmer chose to be herself in an era that demanded she be a mirror. The tragedy isn't what she lost. It's what we refused to let her keep. We killed her with our expectations long before her body gave out. We wanted a star, and when she gave us a human, we punished her for it. Her esophageal cancer was almost a poetic end. The woman whose voice they tried to silence for decades was finally silenced by a tumor in her throat. Her body finally caught up to the silence she'd been forced to live in.
Thanks for watching Shadows of Tinseltown. Subscribe to the channel as this will allow us to create more videos.